Hello and welcome to my channel. My name is Olushola Taiwo. I'm so glad you tuned in. Please go ahead and click the subscribe button if you like what you see. I welcome you to subscribe, and I welcome you to like this video or anything else on this channel, and feel free to share it with other people as well. Here we go. Today we're going to continue reading from this book that I love so much, Our Mother's Sore Expectations by Kehinde Adeola Ayeni. And we're going to read from chapter 8, starting at page 181. Here we go. Teju's depression that, oh, I forgot to tell you where I am. I am at Alexander Park in Windsor, Ontario. Behind me over there is Detroit, Michigan, United States of America. And I'm here on the Canadian side of the border. Okay, here we go. Chapter 8 of Our Mother's Sore Expectations, a novel. Page 181. Teju's depression that year in 1983 on losing her beloved grandfather and the third deformed baby and marriage was short-lived. She did not have the luxury of staying in bed and feeling sorry for herself or wondering what could be wrong with her. A lot was being demanded of the market women. Students all over the country in the many colleges and universities were determined to see an end to the dictator government of Rahim, which had been in place since 1974 and was doing nothing positive for the country. They strongly believed that the preoccupation of the government was in securing their position as the rulers of the people and spending the bulk of the budget on defense. They continued to fight wars amongst themselves with the many coups and counter-coups that continued to plague the nation. Even though Rahim had promised to return the country to democratic rule and had been allowing people to work towards that, the students did not believe that it would happen. The military was too greedy, in their opinion, to just give up and not be in charge of the wealth of the country. The students started to hold demonstrations against the government, most of which would start out peacefully but would deteriorate into riots with destruction of properties and loss of lives of the many young people. More often than not, when the students planned these demonstrations, they would inform the government, and unarmed students would march or hold sit-ins or night vigils to make their points known. The military governors of the different regions would tell the students that they could not hold the peaceful demonstrations and command them to disperse and return to school. The students would refuse. The governors would then send anti-riot police, known by the people as Kill and Go, to restore peace where there had not been any disruption of peace. And it was usually at that point that the situation would take a turn for the worse. The anti-riot police will do what their names denoted. They would attack, beat, tear gas, and shoot at the defenseless students, wounding them, sometimes killing them. This was happening all over the country, and the students were spending more time at home than in schools, as these would be closed for months at a time. Parents were upset about this, especially the many market women, most of whom had sons and daughters in the many universities and colleges. A number of things caused the demonstrations and riots, ranging from lack of equipment and materials for teaching the students to non-payment of lecturers' salaries in the government-controlled institutions. Many people were willing to pay tuitions at these institutions of higher learning if the government would relinquish their hold on them, but the government refused, needing to monitor and control the many intellectuals at these institutions. On this particular day, Teju, as usual, did not get up in the morning to take care of her daughter or of herself. Bosse got Ireti ready for school, and the 7-year-old went to bid her mother goodbye before she left with her grandfather, who was still the principal at the elementary school. Bosse went to her daughter's room and spent about 15 minutes encouraging her to get up out of bed and take a shower. Teju did not answer her mother's plea. She turned over in bed and covered her head with the blanket. Bosse, in exasperation, left the room. She was very worried about her daughter. They were all worried about her. Teju had always been a vivacious person who had always found life either exciting or challenging and had always risen to either situation. They did not know what to make of this depressed Teju. Akin, Teju's oldest brother, felt that they should give her some time and that she would get better and be her old self again. He had explained to the family that she had been bereaved. She had lost her beloved grandfather, and that giving birth to deformed children and losing them other were things to be depressed about, as well as being abandoned by her husband. Bosse left her daughter's room and went to prepare some breakfast for her. She returned 30 minutes later with food, and Teju still would not speak to her mother or get up to eat the food. Bosse left the food in the room and went to get ready for the day. She had been opening Teju's shop in the market at least 3 times a week so that she would not lose her customers. She could understand her daughter's depression in some ways. She had never buried a child in her life, but the dead children were her grandchildren as well, and she had wondered in her own periods of despondency if Teju inherited the genes responsible for the deformity from her because she had a cousin who had given birth to a mentally retarded child. When she was ready, she went to tell Teju that she was leaving for the market and that if she needed anything, her grandmother, who had been coming to stay with her during the day, had arrived. Teju still did not respond. Bosse went over to her daughter and, half lying on the bed next to her, hugged her. Teju softened in her mother's embrace, and Bosse left with tears in her eyes. When she arrived in the market, she saw that all of Teju's neighbors were in groups of 3s and 4s talking. Some of them were crying, and many of them had their hands on their heads, wailing in anguish, or their arms folded on their chests in despair, while most of them held onto their breasts through their bubas, as if the breast had become some unbearably heavy and painful burden. Bosse knew without being told that someone's child was dead. The posture of the women holding onto their breasts is one that mothers assume in empathy when they have heard the news of a mother losing a child. It is as if their breasts had become engorged and painful since a child was dead, a child that could relieve the engorgement by nursing at the breasts. She approached the group of women, and Mama Yabo from across Teju's shop was crying and wailing. Bosse, with much trepidation, asked them what had happened. 3 of the women spoke at once, trying to tell her that Ade was dead. It took a while for her to comprehend, especially with the 3 women speaking at once. She looked vague, and one of them repeated to her that Ade had been killed at the University of Ibadan. The anti-riot police that the government deployed to disperse the demonstrating students killed him the previous day. Bosse stood still for a long time. She knew Ade very well. He had been a very bright student, and she remembered her husband had been very fond of the boy when he was in elementary school. He was in his 4th year at medical school at the university. 1 more year and he would have become a doctor. His mother had the shop to Teju's right, and the poor woman had had to deal with one problem after another in the past 6 years. Her husband had died after a protracted illness that she nursed him through. Then she had the unfortunate luck of marrying the gangster I Go Get Am For You, who terrorized the town about 4 years ago, and after his death, the woman had been trying her hardest to get her life back together. Her daughter, who ran away, had returned. She had been concentrating on her children's welfare and had been working hard to keep Ade in college, as well as 2 of his siblings. This was the last thing she deserved, to have the government kill her son. Bosse thought of all these. She joined the women in crying, and she felt hopeless about the future of the country. If one has to be afraid to send her child to school for him to get an education. The women were so distraught that most of them closed their shops and went over to Mama Ade's house to be with her and offer whatever they could to help her through her grief. Bosse did not bother opening Teju's shop. She went with the women to Mama Ade's house, and when she got there, she joined the almost 100 women in front of the house in their wailing and crying. She tried to see Mama Ade and offer her condolences, but she could not because of the many people there. She promised herself that she would come back later in the day. Bosse went home and found Ireti in the living room playing with her great-grandmother. Ireti answered her grandmother's questioning look by telling her that the school had been closed for the day because an old student was killed in Ibadan. Bosse asked her if she told her mother, and Ireti said that Teju was asleep and she did not want to wake her. Bosse went to her daughter's room and woke her. She told her that Ade was dead, that the police killed him in Ibadan. Teju sat up straight in bed and stared at her mother, who repeated herself. "What did you say?" Teju asked her mother, and Bosse told her that as a result of the students' unrest in the country, the police, on the orders of the military government, had been shooting at students, and Ade was killed the previous day. By this time, Ireti and her great-grandmother had joined the two women in Teju's room. The 4 generations of women looked at one another for a long time, and Teju, giving a cry of anguish, jumped out of bed and, dragging Ireti to her, hugged her child to her as if the people who killed Ade might come for Ireti as well. Why? Why? She cried, looking at her mother to supply her with explanations why Ade was killed. Bosse did not say a word, and she continued to cry. Bosse's mother started to cry too and to pray aloud. Teju sat down heavily on her bed and, still holding Ireti to her on her lap, broke down and wept. They all stayed that way for about an hour, and Teju wept. Her mother and her grandmother knew that she was weeping for herself as well as for Mama Ade. They were happy that she was finally able to weep for her dead children and marriage. They knew that this would mark the beginning of her recovery. So they let her weep, and they joined her in the tears as well, for themselves as mothers, raising children in a country where the government did not care for the citizens, and they wept for all the mothers all over the country. Bayo and the principal arrived to meet the scene of the weeping generations of women. 3 of them mothers, and they, being fathers, joined in the crying. The 2 men wept for their brilliant, promising student who had been like a son to them. He had made them proud. He had been one of the many students who had made their labors as teachers worthwhile. The men spoke with one another and about arrangements for Ade's funeral, and that the 2 schools should offer to help his mother bury him so that she would not have to deal with that event. Later that day, for the first time in weeks, Teju got out of her bed, showered, and joined her family in the living room to talk about the tragedy. The following morning, before 6 o'clock, she left the house and went to the offices of the officials of the Iroko Market Women Association. She called a meeting because she felt that they needed to protest to the government. They should not just stand by and watch as the government killed off their children, because the children protested about bad conditions. Teju, as well as a lot of people in the country, were aware of the doings of the dictator government that had come to occupy them. Every citizen knew of the corruption and violations of civil rights of the people. Every citizen knew that the government, which insisted on having central control of the country, did nothing positive for anyone. Schools were not equipped with what was needed. Hospitals did not have the necessary instruments to treat people. Yet if the doctors and nurses or the teachers complained, they would not be paid their wages. The ones who complained the most ended up in prison or were killed in one freak accident or another. The women met, and it was decided that Teju and the secretary should go to Ibadan and meet with the officials of the regional association to discuss what they needed to do about the problems. That morning, at about 9 o'clock, Teju returned home and told her parents that she was going to Ibadan to meet with the president of the Western Region Market Women Association. Bayo and Bosse looked at one another, and they asked her if she needed them to assist her in any way. "Please keep an eye on Ireti for me," was all she said to her parents. She explained to them that she might be gone for a while and others might come up. Her parents promised to continue to care for their granddaughter, and they silently thanked God that she was her old self again. They knew that the depression had been replaced by anger, and it would mark the beginning of her recovery. Teju was now angry at the injustices being meted out to the citizens by the government. Teju and the secretary of the Iroko Market Women Association arrived in Ibadan later in the afternoon of that day. The regional president met with them right away when they went to her shop at Gbagi Market. Teju told her about Ade and his mother, and that the women in the country should not just stand by and watch while the dictator government killed off their children. If Teju thought that she had a tale of woe to tell because she had been personally touched by Ade's death, the regional president told her more stories of woe. She told Teju and the secretary that she personally knew of 10 other market women who had lost their children during one riot or the other over the past year, and that she knew of at least 20 students who had been wounded in one horrible way or the other, that they would not be able to live a normal life anymore. Teju stared at the president in disbelief as she told her these stories, and that the women did know these many unfortunate people personally. She mentioned their names, their mothers' names, and what each of them had been studying at the university at the time of their death or maiming. And as the regional president, knowing all these, what have you done about it? Teju asked the woman. What is there to do? What will I, as one woman, do? Go fight the military government on my own? She asked Teju with mounting irritation. Yes, that is what you should have done. Exactly that. Go fight the military government, but not on your own. Rather, with all of us market women all over this region. We must be at least 7,000, if not more. We constitute a force that they would not be able to ignore. How could you live with yourself and yet you sit there and tell me all these horrible tales and you have done nothing for the women who appointed you to this position of responsibility? Are you a mother? Without waiting for the woman to respond, she continued, I don't think that you're a mother, because if you were a mother, you wouldn't even need the office of being the president of Market Women Association as your backing to go and fight the government. You have not served us at all. Teju was very angry with her. The president, too, equally angry, shot back at Teju. How dare you come here and speak to me like that? Who do you think you are? Who is your father? What gives you the audacity to question me like that? For your information, I am a mother. I am a mother of 6 children, if you must know, and you owe me an apology for all the things you said to me today. Otherwise what? Teju retorted. She stood up to join the woman who had already been standing, although the president, being a much taller woman, stood a head higher than her. Otherwise what? Teju asked the woman again. What will you do to me? Maybe you would have done something if one of those 6 children of yours had been killed. My name is Tejumade Segi Mureni Keji, since you asked me. My father is Bayo Bankole, and I am from a place called Iroko, a place where we do not stand by with our arms folded across our chests while the government kills off our children. One is too much for us. We have already given the government their sacrifice, and we demand our payments. That is where I am from, and that is who my father is. The president of the Western Region Market Women Association told Teju that she did not know her father, as he was not a prominent man, and that Teju and her friend had to leave since she had more important things to do. Teju's eyes grew bigger and wilder. She turned on the woman, and the secretary who had been with her for a split second thought that she might physically attack the president of the Market Women Association for the Western Region. But Teju, though very angry, maintained control of herself. She was quiet for about half of a minute and then calmly and sadly said to the president, you know, that is the tragedy of this country. You have to be somebody famous or know somebody famous or come from a famous family to be taken seriously. But the consequences of all these are what we will all pay, each and every one of us, non-entity or famous. You have to resign your position. You don't represent us at all. Leave now and go back to the jungle where you came from. We do things in civilized ways in the cities, okay? The president told Teju and walked out of her shop. Teju picked her purse and she and the secretary left. They immediately returned to Iroko and called a meeting of their Market Women Association. Teju reported to the women in detail everything that took place at the meeting in Ibadan. The women became very angry. They made several suggestions, and the final agreement was that the women in Ibadan had to remove her from her position as the regional president. Mama Ireti, the women said almost in unison, we cannot stand by and let this kind of thing continue. Today it is Ade. Whose child will it be tomorrow? We heard the woman, and she just told us that many women had lost their children to this unfair treatment. We have become the enemies in our own homes. We have to do something. Mama Iyabo, Teju's neighbor in the market and the recently bereaved Mama Ade's best friend, stood up and addressed Teju and the women. About 4 or 5 years ago in this town, we were presented with a similar situation when that monster I go get him for you came amongst us. We didn't stand for it. We had him removed, and you helped us a lot, Mama Ireti. You know the anguish of losing a child more than any one of us in this room today. Your losses were ordained by God, and you were powerless about that. But with this kind of loss, we are not powerless. What we need to do and what we are going to need from you is that you continue to lead us as you have always done. You should send delegates to other cities in Western regions. We will appeal to these women to let us join hands together and fight this demonic creature in the form of our government that has come to take our children from us." The women applauded her speech. They decided that they had to start something right away. The riots and the demonstrations had continued to rage on all over the country. Teju stood up and the applause died down. "I agree with all of you, and that is what we need to do. But it will cost us a lot. It will cost us money, as we will not be able to sell in our shops for a while. It will cost us time and energy to mobilize the women in the other cities, especially if they haven't had the kind of loss we have had here in Iroko." She paused and looked around at the women. They were quiet. "How many of you have children in universities and polytechnics?" she asked them, and almost all the women in the room showed their hands. "Then we don't have any choice in the matter. We have to act, and act now," Teju concluded. The women agreed with her, and they spent the rest of the time formulating their plans of action. They divided themselves into 30 groups, each group with 4 or 5 women, and they decided that a group would travel with Teju and the secretary at different times to the many cities in Western region to meet with the other market women. That way, the rest of them could continue at home, take care of business, and also take care of the traveling groups, shops, and families for them. Teju knew that her parents, the principal, and her grandmother will take care of Ireti and her shop for her, and the secretary had a mother who would help her with her shop as well. So they started to go around the region to one city after another, tirelessly meeting and talking with the many members of the many market associations. They were well received by the different groups of women. Most of the members of the associations they met had been touched by similar tragedies. It seemed like everyone had a story to share with Teju and her group. Teju heard a lot. Her ears were full of horrors of what the citizens had been enduring from their dictator government. Everyone from all walks of life had something to share with her. Not all the stories concerned the plight of the demonstrating students. It seemed like the government would use every opportunity to abuse and molest its students, from the governors of the region withholding the wages of civil servants to the policeman on the street and the clerk at the post office. The governors on many occasions would tell the citizens that he had gone to Lagos hat in hand to ask for money to run his region. Most of the time, he would not be given the funds. The money that was locally generated in the regions had to be paid to the national purse, mixed with money generated from other regions and then given back to them to run their regions. No region had a source of income independent of the federal government. This had been put in place by the federal government following the end of the Civil War, especially to cripple the east and southern regions of the country, where the bulk of the national wealth was generated in the form of petroleum, and also to prevent any region from having enough financial independence to entertain the idea of secession. It also ensured that the northern region, which did not have any source of revenue, would have spending money relying heavily on the southern and eastern regions for its survival. Several market women who had friends or relatives in top posts in the regional government told Teju that the governor even complained to them that when Rahim went on regional visits, which he did as often as once in 3 months, the governors had to give him money as thanks. Thanks for what? They wondered amongst themselves. Thanks for being the president of the country? The man receives a salary and he embezzles money all the time. And then he still demands some of the money given to the governors to run the regions. Why is he so greedy? And usually the amounts run into millions of dollars. The governor, on his part, would sit on the money that eventually arrived for him to run the region. He would put it into his account in Switzerland or wherever abroad to generate interest, and then return some of it to pay workers' wages. At times, some of the workers are not paid for 4 to 6 months. If they protested or complained, they were fired and they lose all their benefits like pensions. If they were rehired, the years of services they had put in would be lost. Wow. Then the women told her of the unseasoned harassment from the policemen all over town, especially the ones in the market. The men demanded bribes all the time. whenever they went to the various villages to buy products. They sold in the markets. The police would stop their vehicles, which were usually public transport, harass the drivers, demanding bribes from them, beating them as if they did not give them enough money, and sometimes shooting them. Who are you to report to when the police are the ones committing these atrocities? Then the police would visit the women in their shops and threaten to arrest them for one fabricated crime, and the women had to pay them. Wow, the police are pathetic, the women told Teju, but that they actually felt sympathy for them. What do you expect them to do? They don't get paid for months as well, and their families have to feed. The women could appreciate the fact that the police are pushed to harassing citizens and even killing them. The government gave guns to hungry and desperate people. Most of the armed robbers are police officers, or at least they had the backing of the police officers who supplied them with firearms. One woman told Teju that the robbers came to her house and stole from her and her husband in the middle of the night. They phoned the police before the robbers got to their bedroom, and the police told them that they would have loved to help them, but that they did not have any vehicle to come to their rescue. The armed robbers took all the money they had in the house, stole their television set and stereo equipment, asked the women to cook for them at that early hour of 2 o'clock. She cooked for them. She prepared pounded yam and vegetable soup on the instruction of the robbers. Many of her neighbors heard her pounding away in the middle of the night and knew that they were being robbed, which was the style of the new gang of robbers who had been harassing people in that neighborhood. Excuse me. But as they later apologized to her that they could not come to her rescue as they might be the next victims. After she prepared the meal and the robbers ate, they dragged her at gunpoint to the bedroom she shared with her husband of 25 years and raped her one after another on her sacred matrimonial bed while they tied up her husband. The worst part of the whole thing was that they were all young enough to be her children. The next day, for record purposes, the couple went to the police to file a report. The leader of the robbers was the police officer behind the desk to take their statement. What do? We apologized to him that we had missed our way and that we were supposed to be going to another government office, and ran out of the police station. One of her neighbors later told her that one of the robbers was the son of a general in the army. This young man had been sent to the best schools in England and America with the country's money. He did not attend the schools. He spent his time using drugs, according to the story that she heard from her neighbors, and now he was back in the country working as an armed robber. Mama Ireti, can you believe what our country has become? These are children who watch their fathers steal with pens all their lives. So they learn very well, and now they steal with guns. Owuti agbon lomo aun. It is a proven fact that children learn from their parents. The woman concluded her story to Teju. The police kill our children when they protest and demonstrate, they lamented to Teju and her group. Then they kill our children when they put up roadblocks to demand bribes of the public bus drivers. At least 5 mothers who sell in this market have lost children to these senseless deaths. And these were well-educated children. These children would have been the pride of any country. They were on their way to becoming lawyers and teachers. Not to start to speak of the soldiers, the women lamented. The non-commissioned soldiers were menaces in town. There were men in the ranks of private up to sergeants. They beat people up for no reason at all. When they came into town, they expect the civilians to salute and get out of their way without even saying, "Excuse me." If you don't, you have yourself to blame. One woman told Teju that her husband was at home paralyzed for life. What was his offense? The woman started. What was his offense? The woman started her story. There was a shortage of petroleum as usual. Remember, Mama Ireti, that this is the country of ours, where oil is drilled every day and the oil is exported to other countries. But at home, we don't have the petroleum to use. Anyway, in the whole of this huge city of Ibadan with 2 million people, 1 petrol station, the woman emphasized by raising up her right index finger. And we're going to end right here. Thank you so much. It's page 193, 2 paragraphs down. We'll continue later on. I thank you for tuning in. My name is Olushola Taiwo, and I appreciate you tuning onto my channel, Olushola Live. If you like what you've heard, go ahead and subscribe, and you can order the book by emailing the author directly. Her name, first name Kehinde Ayeni 26@gmail.com. Again, Kehinde Ayeni 26@gmail.com. Bye for now, and have a great rest of the day. Ciao.